I was born in Miami, Florida, on 15th Avenue in Liberty City, at home, delivered by a midwife named Miss Cooper. Is that as far back as we need to go? my my parents and the four of us were a intact family that had dinner at 6 o'clock every day. We also went to church on a very regular basis. My father was a lay leader in the church, as was his brother, one of his brothers. So we went to Sunday school, morning service, uh, Bible study, and evening service on Sunday. And then on Tuesday nights, we had Bible study. And then on Thursday night, we had song practice. So I was religious out almost. But anyhow, the effect of that upbringing was that I grew up with a strong sense of right and wrong and good and bad because my parents were folk who believed very strongly in doing the right thing, being good, doing for others. We had a grocery store, and quite often folk would come in who didn't have money for what they wanted to buy. And my folk had one of these black and white speckled books you learn how to make your alphabet in, and that was called the book. So folk would come in and say, "Will you put it on the book?" And I remember that when that store was closed, there were still a lot of people on the book. But my parents never sought to make anybody pay. They were just kind and generous kind of people. And that was a big influence for me. I wanted to be like them. And I came to Atlanta to go to college because there was no college in Miami that I could attend because of race. The next year after I left, they started Miami-Dade Junior College, and they had the black students on my high school campus and the white students on a white high school campus. Um, but various recruiters came to our school, including from Morehouse and Clark and Hampton and some others. And Morehouse offered me an early admission scholarship from 11th grade. I declined that offer because I'd been elected student body president for the next year. And I thought I'd stay around and be big man on campus. And I also assumed that they wouldn't have a 12th grade unless I needed it. Yeah, that wasn't true. But at the same time, they offered a young man who was in 10th grade who had been elected my vice president of the student government for the next year, named Donald Hopkins. He accepted his scholarship from 10th grade. So instead of being a year behind me as he was in high school, he was a year ahead of me when I got to Morehouse. He became Dr. Donald Hopkins and is largely credited with eliminating smallpox and the guinea worm. He worked for the World Health Organization, worked for CDC, worked for the Carter Center. So that's kind of how I got here. And I remember my arriving in Atlanta on the train at the terminal train station. It was my first stop here.
And this would be what year?
That would be 1958, September of 1958. And I saw for the first time the Confederate battle flag on prominent display on the side of a building. And I also saw red brick buildings for the first time in life. Um, and there were cobblestone or red brick sidewalks, and some streets still had cobblestone. All this was very new to me. Houses in Miami were built with CBS construction, they call it, concrete block and sand. So I'd never seen brick homes or anything like that. So that was my coming here. The terminal train station sat on the site where the Richard Russell Federal Building stands now. And that station was also the first place that I was arrested for sit-ins. A.D. Williams King, Martin's brother, and I took a large group into the white waiting room, and some of us were arrested there. Yeah, Miami was very different, though. Miami was much more cosmopolitan. You had a lot of folk from the Northeast that had second homes in Miami, and many who had moved there. You also had a large Jewish population concentrated mostly on Miami Beach. But you also had a lot of folk from the Caribbean, from Puerto Rico, folk from the Bahamas, not so many from Jamaica, but the Bahamas and Puerto Rico were the largest groups that I was aware of growing up there. And the segregation was a little bit more polite, I would say. I don't remember anybody, calling me awful names or being really rude and crude. It was just kind of understood, that the races were separate. We did have signs on the buses that said, "Colored seat from rear, whites seat from front." And there were black and white water fountains. Blacks could not go to the restaurants and the hotels. There were separate taxi cabs. Black folk rode in jitneys that connected to the bus lines. So it was separate. Uh, well, a jitney is like a taxi cab, except it has prescribed routes, and it was like a big DeSoto or a Dodge vehicle that had middle fold down seats and seats in the back and all that, and they were all black, and they essentially connected the black communities uh, near the bus lines, the bus stops, and all that. I don't recall black taxi cabs. I'm sure there were, but don't recall those. What I discovered years later, after I'd left, was that if you were black, I mean physically black, but spoke a different language, which was the case with many Cubans that were there. That was the other large population. Um, you could go into the theaters and the hotels and restaurants. It was just American blacks that were not good enough. Interesting, right? Yeah. And I saw snow for the very first time. We had snow in late in September or in October, and all the guys from Florida came running out of the dorms to look at this mystery stuff. And my roommate grabbed some and took it inside to try to look at it under a microscope to see the patterns that you always see of. And of course, it melted. But that was my first snow. I always remember that. And I decided, as a matter of fact, my first 2 weeks here, probably by the end of the first week here, that I would live in Atlanta because I had not seen so many pretty black women before in my life. I said, this is a place I can live. And I did. I've stayed ever since. Well, it was an environment that was, I don't know, enlightening and inspiring in a broad sense. Dr. Mays, Benjamin E. Mays, was president at the time, and he addressed the student body once a week. And of course, his messages were always progressive messages. He had written a book called Born to Rebel. But we also had visiting speakers from across the country who were people of note. I remember the guy who invented uh, penicillin was there. The guy who wrote "Cry the Beloved Country" was there. Um, People like Masters and Johnson, the sex therapist people were there. Uh, some of the great Morehouse alums came and spoke. So you had this invigorating kind of intellectual environment. Um, we also, living on campus, we would have bull sessions at night, which means we studied together and kibitz to bit and all that. But we did a lot of studying together in the dorms. So that was a good thing. But there was no talk of rebellion or revolt against the status quo in those earlier days. We were busy with things on campus. I immediately got involved in the newspaper on campus. I was in the Atlanta Morehouse Bellman Chorus. I was on the yearbook staff. I was on the student court. And later on, I was on the debate team. And eventually, I was editor of the school newspaper for my junior and senior year, and president of my senior class, and then chairman of the Atlanta Student Movement. And three of those things were concurrent. The senior class president, editor of the newspaper, and chairman of the movement, all at the same time. Um, and our most important thing, of course, was to try to spend as much time on Spelman's campus as possible. Because if you were a student anywhere in the Atlanta University Center, you could attend classes on any of the other campuses, and the credits went directly to your school. Uh, Julian and I both spent a lot of time with that. I remember we had creative writing class that involved like three or four of us in the faculty person's home on campus. Um, but I took a lot of English classes and the like over there. And there was a nickname for people like me in those days. Our dinner line closed at 6 o'clock. Visiting hours at Spelman ended at 6 o'clock. So you're trying to stay on Spelman's campus at the last possible second and also make it to dinner before the line closed. And so the name they gave us was Willie's. Will he make it? I was a Willie. I was a Willie. So those were fun days. We had, all kind of nice social events and things on campus, plays and concerts and football. I have to tell you a secret about me and Julian football games. We would often go together, and Julian had a silver flask in which there was rum, and I would buy the Coke, and we would make our rum and Coke drinks. And at Julian's urging, when everything was quiet in the stadium, the two of us would stand up and go, "Hey!" to nothing in particular. So my fondest memories of Julian are silly stuff. We had a lot of silly times together. He's the greatest joke teller ever, and I repeat a number of his jokes a lot to people now. Well, immediately after the sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina, um, Lonnie King was over at the local hangout, which was Yates and Milton Drugstore, where they had soda fountain and all and booths. And he and a guy named Joe Pierce initially had a discussion about what had happened in Greensboro. And then he went over to Julian. And Lonnie asked Julian, had you seen he had a newspaper, he said, had you seen the story in the paper? And Julian says that he thought I was asking if I read a newspaper. Of course, everybody reads a newspaper. And Julian said, yeah. And Lonnie asked him, well, don't you think something like that ought to happen here? And Julian's response was, I'm sure that someday somebody here will probably do that. And Lonnie said, no, I mean, what about us? And Julian's reaction was kind of like, what do you mean, white man? As Tonto would say to Lone Ranger. But anyhow, the three of them agreed to take the store and go and talk to people around in there. And they invited some folk to a meeting that very same night, as I recall. And we had this meeting over on Morehouse's campus at the at the Sage Hall Annex, one-story little building there. And there were, I think, 18 to 20 of us there. And so Lonnie pitches the whole thing about doing something like that here. And at the end of it all, he asked those who were not willing to participate not to talk about it, just going back to business. Well, somebody talked. And as a result of that, the presidents of the schools called some of us in with the mission of talking us out of doing this thing because they were responsible for us, for our education, for our safety. And of course, they had to answer to board of trustees, and they didn't want to cut the money off. So we spent a lot of time, talking back and forth. And when they were convinced that we were going to do these things, anyhow, Dr. Rufus Clement, who was president of Atlanta University, which was separate from Clark at the time, suggested that we should let the public know why we were doing what we were going to do. And so the suggestion was made that we publish a document. They would raise the money to run it in the newspaper as a full-page ad. The document became known as an appeal for human rights. Lonnie appointed a committee of us to do this document. Rosalind Pope, Julian Bond, myself, Morris Dillard, and I think Albert Brinson. our cell phones weren't working that well in those days. So Rosalind apparently had difficulty reaching all of us. So she calls Lonnie like a day or so before this document is to be presented back to the presidents and tells her that nobody's helping her. And so Lonnie told her, just write the damn thing. So Rosalind wrote the damn thing. I refer to her as Dr. Rosalind Pope because she has 3 PhDs. Uh, and she wrote this seminal document, which spelled out all the areas of discontent that we had, which included places of public accommodation, transportation, education, police activity, religion, church segregation, all that. I remember the line that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning was the most segregated hour in the city. And it was signed by either the president or some officer of the Student Government Association from all of the schools in the center. There were one or two who were afraid to sign. And it should be noted that a lot of the students didn't participate because they were local and their parents might lose their jobs. They were teachers or whatever, but could lose their jobs. And so their parents didn't want them to participate. Others similarly situated did participate against their parents' wishes. But that was the nature of our beginnings. Yeah. The governor at the time was Governor Ernest Vandiver, and he went on TV and declared that this document was extremely well written. It could not have been written by any student in the state of Georgia. He didn't say black students, any student in the state of Georgia. And it was most likely written in Moscow. That was a high praise for Rosalind's work, but an indictment of the whole system of education in the state of Georgia. I don't guess he realized that at the time. The document was read into the congressional record by Senator Jacob Javits of New York. It was picked up by the New York Times and run free of charge. There's a full-page ad there. And also by a paper in California, I think it was the LA Times. So it had that kind of impact. Later on, folk in Birmingham published almost the same document, just changed Atlanta to Birmingham in the document and made few other changes. So it had an impact, and the general community, of course, understood our message because it was, very clearly stated. I might mention there was another organization in town called the Atlanta Committee for Cooperative Action, and those were the generation between us and the older established black community. It was your Jesse Hills, your Carl Holmans, Clarence Coleman, Richardson, people like that, Johnny Johnson. And they had published a document called A Second Look. And it spelled out a lot of factual stuff that was used in the appeal for human rights. So she drew upon that for some stuff. And it was 1 week later after the document was published that we had our first sit-ins. The Atlanta Daily World's publisher, C.A. Scott, was a very conservative Republican who incidentally endorsed Nixon and Goldwater when all the black papers in the country were not supporting them. He editorialized against our movement and did not give us fair coverage. He agreed to publish the ad, but had to be paid in advance. The Atlanta Journal and Constitution billed us, they billed the presidents for it. He had to be paid in advance. And the nature of his attitude in that paper is what led to the need for a new organ, and that became the Atlanta Inquirer newspaper.
Did it surprise you that the Journal and the Constitution, and they both published it?
Yes.
Did it surprise you that they would?
No, because it was money. It was paid. It was paid advertising. Yeah. So that didn't surprise me. They would not have done it for free. That's for sure. But in the general community, I think we garnered a lot of support in the black community because everybody read the newspaper in those days. We didn't do a lot of texting and and tweeting and all that because our cell phones weren't working that well. But so we got the message across to the community, the broad community, and the black community in particular, because everybody was reading the newspaper. So we had a lot of support right from the start when we had our first sit-ins. Well, I'll tell you how I got involved in the Inquirer. There's a guy named Julian Bond who talked me into joining the staff.
Well, we'll talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, and he was there, and he was like an associate editor or something. And not very long after he talked me into joining the staff, he left and went to work for SNCC, getting paid probably more than had the Inquirer. But that's how I ended up there. The paper was originally printed by J. Lowell Ware, who subsequently founded the Atlanta Voice. There was a guy named Kossuth Hill who had an office supply place on Auburn Avenue, and for a brief period, the Atlanta student movement had offices on Auburn Avenue. And Kossuth Hill was a very white-looking gentleman who walked into the office one day when Lonnie was there, and the receptionist, whoever, escorted him back to where Lonnie was, and Lonnie was wondering, who's this white man coming here? He's afraid that this is going to be a problem. And when he told him that he was Kossuth Hill, obviously Lonnie realized who he was. He had the Atlanta Inquirer name, and he also had a printing press. So he volunteered to give the Inquirer to the students as an organ, and he would print the initial copies. And that's how that got started. Prior to that time, we were mimeographing flyers. And then kids today don't know what a mimeograph machine is, but you crank the handle and you did one copy at a time. And then eventually you might get an electric one, and it did one copy at a time for you. So that's how we were getting our word out. Julian was editing something called the Student Movement in You, a flyer that we put out, distributed mostly to churches, but also some door-to-door distribution. And so the Inquirer replaced that. And after I'd been at the Inquirer for a while, I became the managing editor, where I served for about 3 years. We had the Atlanta Daily World giving bad publicity for what we were doing and editorializing against us. So it was important for us to get our message out. In addition to the distribution that you mentioned, that Julian and Lonnie talked about, we had at that time the Atlanta Negro Voters League, which was organized down to the block level. You had ward captains and you had block captains or whatever, ward leaders, whatever. We tapped into that structure to some extent, but we also put it in barber shops and beauty shops and restaurants and all the places that black folk would frequent. So that was a part of our distribution system as well. But we had our organ then. We had our organ. And Julian Bond, very interesting fellow, was extremely good writer. And he typed his material with 2 fingers, like that, but was extremely fast in doing it. So he produced, he served as a PR guy for the student movement, for doing Lonnie's term and mine as well. And he was getting out press releases, right and left. He would sometimes tell us what we had said. He would create the message and quote you and tell us that we said that. But he became the PR guy for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and I would visit with him regularly over there, and he was constantly sending out press releases and pictures of what was happening with SNCC. Yeah. Well, of course, his father was a president of college. His mother was a librarian, as I recall. Julian had more books than I had seen anywhere outside of a library. I would visit with him in his home. His mom would make sandwiches for us and all, and we'd sit around and chat and all that. And I remember the first time I went into his room or den, wherever it was, and saw this whole wall covered with books. I said, Julian, have you read all those books? He said, yeah. I'm talking hundreds and hundreds of books. I think I'd read 2 books by then now. But he was extremely well-read, very intelligent, very knowledgeable guy. And his writing talent was probably enhanced by having so much in his head already, and being in that intellectual environment at home. But he was a super writer. Yeah,
Talk about that.
yeah. I think it was something of a natural talent, but perhaps genetic to some extent as well. But if you grew up in that kind of environment, you always on college campus, you're around people like Einstein, whom his father had awarded the first honorary doctorate because the other schools wouldn't do so because Einstein was Jewish. But he grew up in that kind of environment with all this intellectualism around him. So it's natural that he would learn to express himself well, verbally as well as in writing. But he could do it with such ease. I mean, you just sit down and boom, there's a story. you know, he was my role model. Julian also edited a literary paper on campus called the Pegasus, I believe. The Pegasus, yes. Um, and so he was into literary expression. But it's one thing to write, you know, instructional kind of material or technical material, It's another thing to write um, a message that communicates to the spirit and the soul of a person, so that you understand um, what the emotions, the sentiments are, and where you're coming from. And Julian had a knack for doing that. He did that extremely well. He could speak from his heart to your heart. Um, and where that comes from entirely, I'm not sure, but he did it extremely well. And it was important in the community because this was something new and different for the black community. We'd fought our battles in the courts with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. That's how things got changed. Except the generation before us, unbeknownst to me, had taken some direct actions, some bus boycotts and some strikes to get teacher pay increased and things of that sort. Um, John Calhoun went to jail for refusing to give up the membership rules of the NAACP. A lot of those things we didn't know about. We didn't know the shoulders on which we stood. But anyhow, that was more the way of doing things, the courts, before we came along. And so you had to get people to understand that this was a new and different way of getting change more rapidly because we were interested in revolutionary rather than evolutionary change. So communicating all that was very important. There was definite tension between us and the older established leadership. You'd get the reaction, and these things take time. You got to be patient. And we didn't really want to hear that too much more. You have to understand that we were the generation that followed what Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation. Our parents, uncles, and all that had gone overseas to fight to make the world safe for democracy. All right? But they came back and they were called niggers. You know, some were beaten, some were even killed wearing their uniforms. But they had no rights that they were fighting for others. So we were born a bit unhappy, as Dr. May said, born to rebel. So it was kind of in our makeup that we were not going to go for this gradual thing for too much longer. We thought that there should be some here and now, that we'd like to enjoy these benefits in our lifetime, and for our children, prepare things better for our children. So we were not that patient anymore. You mentioned Emmett Till. We were only a few months difference in age at the time that he was lynched. So that struck me at the time. Here's a guy my age being murdered in this fashion. So I remember that for all the rest of my life. So we had seen enough and heard enough to know that things were not good, and we wanted things to be better. Um, but what made the difference in our moving to the revolutionary rather than evolutionary approach was an example that the guys in Greensboro gave. We had always wanted things to change sooner, but they showed us a way to do it, and we seized upon that. And also the example of the Montgomery bus boycott, civil disobedience, nonviolent civil disobedience. And we saw that that kind of approach could change things. and could change things much more rapidly than through the courts. So that's what gave us our push. Yeah, Attorney Donald Hollowell was our lawyer. Some other lawyers helped in different things, but he was our lawyer, and was King's lawyer here as well. He was a big guy, not extremely tall, but he had a very commanding presence. He had a big, strong, booming voice. He had big hands and big feet. And when he addressed the judge, he would say, "But Your Honor, I submit to you." Such and such was the case. And he almost always knew much more law than any judge that he appeared before. So he was our guy. He was our guy. And, fortunately, we've named a street for him, which was Bankhead Highway, now Donald Lee Hollowell Boulevard, I think it is. Might mention, too, that Horace Ward was his partner in his law firm, and he also worked with him on some of the cases, as did Bill Alexander, who became a legislator, the legislator, and Howard Moore, who was married to Julian's sister, Jane, also was a part of that law firm. Horace Ward, of course, became a federal judge. And he and Hollowell also did the case of the University of Georgia with Hamilton Holmes and Charlene Honeygault desegregating the school there. So that was a big deal. Horace had been denied admission to that school, as I recall, earlier on. So it was poetic justice that he was a lawyer that broke that barrier. Yeah. Well, that year was the first time we had a group running for the state legislature. Leroy Johnson had been elected to the state senate, and as I recall, Horace Ward had been elected as well. Or maybe he was in that group. I worked with Julian in his campaign, and the thing that impressed me most about the way the campaign was run was, and I guess it was probably Julian's idea, but I helped him. We had coffee clatches in folks' homes, and what we would ask them what their concerns were, what problems they were experiencing, and we had people working on the campaign who would get on those problems the very next day. It was a city matter they called City Hall. It was a county matter they called the courthouse. It was a state matter they called somebody at the Capitol, and got some resolution of many of the problems that people were facing. And that was a large part of the success of his campaign as to why he was elected. He wasn't just promising what he was going to do. He showed people that he would do it. And it didn't matter that it wasn't a state matter. It could have been a city matter. It didn't matter. Folk needed help, and we had some people ready to get on the case the next day. So he was elected along with the rest of them. And the reason he was not seated was because SNCC had issued a statement critical of the war in Vietnam, and it referred to the U.S. as murderous in that situation. Julian had not seen that statement at the time, that he received a phone call from a reporter on radio, I forget what his name was, asking him if he agreed with the statement by SNCC. And he said, yeah, all right, all hell broke loose. And Jesse Hill and some of us had a meeting at Herman Russell's house with Julian and several of us, and we were discussing, what should be done. And I made the suggestion that Julian should issue his own statement, which might not be as caustic, but still supportive, and with the same message. And everybody agreed that was the thing to do. So Julian and I and somebody else go into another room, and we draft the statement that Julian is going to issue. Well, the next day, when I think Julian is going to issue the statement, he changed his mind and decided he would not issue this statement, which would stand by his support of the SNCC statement. And that's what got him booted out of the House. I was there with him at the time they refused to seat him, up in the colored section, of course, in the balcony. Well, you have to remember that the state legislature represented trees and hogs more than it did people. The state has 159 counties, and we used to have what they call the county unit system, which meant that the smallest county in the state had the same representation as Fulton County, which was the largest, which made no sense. So, whereas Atlanta was willing to be more progressive because what was good for business was good for Atlanta was their slogan. The rest of the state was pretty bad. Very racist in most places around the state. So it was not surprising at all that you would have that racism still there. When we had sit-ins at the state capitol, I remember Representative Sloppy Floyd, for whom the towers are named, stood in the well of the house and pointed up toward the balcony and said, "Get those niggas out of the white section of the balcony." That's the guy we have towers named for. But anyhow, I was there when Julian was refused his seat. He did not stand. He was not called to stand. And after they refused to give him his seat, I remember he asked me to take him home to get some pills because he would break out in a rash. And prior to that time, when Julian didn't want to walk picket lines anymore, he wanted to stay at the office. He broke out in a rash on the picket line. And I was convinced it was because of the heat and all that sort of thing. So when he broke out in the rash in the air-conditioned state capitol, I teased him. I said, "Julian, that had nothing to do with the heat. You just break out in a rash if you're nervous or afraid or something, right?" And he kind of laughed it off, but that's what would happen to him. Well, I'll tell you one thing that's important to note. Many black folk crossed the street rather than encountering Julian on the sidewalk during that period. Because, folks said he's a bad guy, and black folk were buying into that. I don't know if that's ever been reported much, but I witnessed that firsthand. You can see people coming down, going to somewhere, you know where they're going. And they would literally cross over the street rather than encounter Julian, speak to him. But anyhow, it became national news, worldwide news, that he had been denied the seat, and it was appealed up to the Supreme Court, who ordered that he be seated. And at this point, he was a rock star. He was a big hero of young folk all over the country, and I guess in many parts of the world. Well, Julian had become famous. I mean, really famous all around, especially on college campuses. He was eventually a regular speaker on college campuses all over the country. He was signed by the William Morrison Agency. They would get these gigs for him. They would book him. They would send him a stack of airline tickets bound together, and he would just went to one place after another. And they were paying good money, to have Julian Bond on campus. He tried to get me to travel with him and help write speeches and all that, but I didn't do that. So he was very famous by the time the convention came along, and there was a push to nominate him for vice president, ignoring the fact that he wasn't old enough. He and John Lewis and I were off to the side, talking about what to do and all that, and so we agreed that he should accept the nomination to make a speech, and so he did get a chance to address the convention.
So you were
Because
at, like,
yeah, I was there. I was there with him. Yeah. Not at all. Julian was supposed to become a college president. He was going to teach English as an English professor and become a college president. That was a natural route for Julian. He was not very outgoing. He was, like I say, he was a pretty shy guy, and not at all a self promoter, and would not have projected himself into what happened to him. Is because of what he stood for and what happened to him that made him the superstar, and he had to embrace that. But he grew into it and became as big a star as he should have been. But at that convention, people were gathered around him, like he was a rock star. Especially young white folk, especially young white girls, trying to encourage him. You ought to run, you ought to run, run. And they were gathering around. We were trying to keep him at bay while we talk. But he was regarded like a big superstar at the time. And I remember going somewhere with him. I think it was University of Georgia campus in Athens. That somebody asked me for my autograph because I was with him. That's how big he was. Yeah, with respect to Julian and the status that he attained, there's an expression that some men are born great, some men attain greatness or achieve greatness, and others have greatness thrust upon them. Julian had greatness thrust upon him, but he was inherently great. He was not seeking greatness, not projecting greatness, but folk insisted, to promote him and pedestalize him for who he was and what he stood for. So it was more thrust upon him than being pursued. And nobody would have predicted that Julian would have been in any ways notarized. He would be somewhere quiet doing his thing, writing, teaching, but not on stage addressing thousands of people and leading things. Now, Julian Bond was a fun guy, and I just enjoyed being with him all the time. He always had jokes. We formed a corporation together called Frontiers Unlimited Consulting Firm. Julian Bond, Lonnie King, John Lewis, and myself. And I ran the firm for a decade or so. I bought them out after a year because what they were doing was sending me slick people to hire for the most part. But
Talk a little, just a little bit. I'm curious. What was this firm? What were you consulting?
Okay, we formed the firm really at the behest of the Office of Economic Opportunity.
And the name of it again was
Frontiers Unlimited.
Frontiers
Unlimited, yeah, and formed in 1969. And the first contract that we had was with OEO to assist community action programs in the South with community organization because we were known for doing that sort of thing. So that was our first contract. And an interesting thing happened. Folk who competed against us was a firm called Wright, Jackson, Brown, Williams, and Stevens, black friends of ours, who were a PR firm. And Lonnie surmised later it was they who started this whole inquiry, but charges were made that we were using this $158,000 contract that we'd gotten to run Julian Bond for Congress against the Republican Fletcher Thompson. There was no truth to that at all. All right. So it results in a major investigation of our firm that lasted for like 4 months. Our activities were suspended. We ended up going to OEO, to the Office of Economic Opportunity. At the time, the director was Rumsfeld. His deputy was Dick Cheney. When this investigation of our firm, to establish that Julian was running against Fletcher Thompson, we were using the funds of this contract to do that. They spent about 4 months and about $500,000 by conservative estimates investigating us. We had Army intelligence investigating us, the CIA investigating us, the FBI, the Government Accounting Office, and the investigative arm of OEO. All these folk were investigating us at one time. So when they sent investigators down, I just gave them a key to the office and the files and say, help yourself. I'm going to lunch. And these little pink pads while you were out, got any messages, take them. And so we just turned loose in the office and had long lunches. This went on for, and we had, at that point we had assisted about 42 different agencies. We're in the beginning stages for the most part. And they checked with all these people and, nobody said anything about, this politics or anything. So anyhow, after it's gone on for so long, Fletcher Thompson was the one asked for the investigation. He got Richard Russell to support this investigation. So we asked for a meeting with OEO, and we called Richard Russell's office and asked him, to call OEO if he was done with all this and all. We went to his office first, Richard Russell's office first, and talked to his people. By the time we got over to OEO, his folk had called OEO. We go into the meeting, and Donald Rumsfeld was the head of OEO at the time, who later became Secretary of Defense or Secretary of Disaster, whichever. And Dick Cheney was his deputy, who later became Vice President. Dick Cheney. All right. The Cheney was conducting the meeting. Our attorney from Arnold, and what's his name? I forgot the name of the firm in town, but Alexander was the attorney's name, who became the first black Secretary of the Army. So he's our attorney. So we have Julian Bond, Lonnie King, John Lewis, myself, and our attorney, and Dick Cheney running the meeting. And Rumsfeld came in to meet Julian, because Julian was the most famous person out of this whole crowd at the time. That was still 1969. Yeah. But he specifically came into the room just to meet Julian. Because Julian was the big man in the crowd. Isn't that something? Well, the major contribution that Julian made to SNCC, for example, was to raise their profile significantly, because he was constantly putting stories out all day, every day. He was doing press releases and getting pictures sent to all the news media. So nobody would have known about SNCC if it hadn't been for Julian Bond. He also became very active with the Voter Education Project. He and John Lewis went around the South doing that. And so they had major impact in that respect. And politically, when he got involved in politics directly, his presence meant a lot at the state capitol. I remember asking him once, well, Julian, why don't you introduce more legislation? And he said it was because his name was the kiss of death on anything that he would sponsor.
Why?
Because they hated him. These are racists. The legislature was a racist place. All these guys representing trees and hogs.
But was there always like a special hate for Julian as opposed to other black members of the legislature, or was he just one?
Well, he of course had to be saying a lot because he beat them. He forced them to seat him. They didn't want to, and the Supreme Court made them seat him. So they hated him more than anybody else. So he felt that any legislation that had his name on it would automatically be the kiss of death. And he later started, advocating more. But the fact that he spoke on college campuses a lot for years, on many college campuses, he influenced a lot of college students, that generation of college students, and probably actually 2 generations, if not more, of college students, because he continued to do that quite a bit. And when he became chairman of the board of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, I mean, he had tremendous influence that way. But all that is secondary to me. What was most important to me was Julian, the person, because I enjoyed him so much. He had a great sense of humor, and he liked having fun. One thing I remember in particular, he and John Lewis and I took our wives to the Royal Peacock on Auburn Avenue to see the Temptations. And it took weeks for us to get Julian to stop singing. I guess you say. And he would make every motion with every word and all this other thing. So that was one thing. And another time we were at Don Clendenin's place on what was Hunter Street, and Red Fox was there, and during the break, because Julian was famous and all, John wasn't. He came back to our table, to chat with us, chat with Julian actually, and everybody was gathering around to see what he said, assuming there's gonna be something funny he said. Right? But we used to run together a goodly bit, the 3 couples of us. And we had John was not involved in this next thing so much, but if at all, as I recall, we came up with something called Family Olympics. And what we would do on a single day, we would start at one person's house, and we would have brunch there, and we engage in various kinds of competitions. It might be shooting basketballs, kicking footballs, arm wrestling, any number of things. I think you won in arm wrestling, Phyllis, against somebody. But I remember Julian and Alice had a bicycle built for two, and it was somebody's bike. I don't know, but we competed. People competed on the bike, and they won that competition. We would go to the next house, and we would have dinner, and then we go to the next house, and we would have dessert and drinks in the evening. And we did that for a few years, and it was great fun. But Julian also smoked cigarettes. He smoked Salem cigarettes, and he romanced the cigarette. I think he's responsible for me smoking cigarettes. He'd be driving in the car, and he drove holding the steering wheel like this, and he would change the radio station anytime a commercial came on to more music, and he would smoke the cigarette like that, like it was the most important thing in the world, most delicious thing, and put it out. And so, I'm riding around with him in that little car. I forgot what that little lime green car was that he had at the time. Um, but when he would come to the office, when we had the consulting firm, Frontiers Unlimited, and he would come into my office, I was president, and close the door. Other staff assumed that there was something really important going on. And a lady who would later become my wife finally found out that what Julian was doing was coming there telling me jokes. And so she refused to leave. So I'm not going to leave. Y'all don't tell me anything about it. And Julian always had some good jokes to tell when we would come back, and he would come and report his jokes.
A family audience or not?
Yeah, most of them were. Um, there was one I remember in particular. He talked about the immortal porpoises. There were these two porpoises, and they were white porpoises that, as far as anybody could remember, they were always there in the sea. We see them going. So they were there for so long. People said they were immortal. Okay, so some guy decided that he was going to capture these porpoises. He's going to make a bunch of money, right? So he tried all kinds of things to capture the porpoises, and nothing was working. And somebody told him that these porpoises were fond of seagulls. All right, so he gets a couple of seagulls, and he goes down to the beach, and he sees the porpoises, and he's running toward the beach with the porpoises. At which point, a lion, which had escaped from the state zoo, runs right in front of him, and he has to jump over the lion to keep from being run over. At which point, he was arrested for transporting gulls across the state line for immortal porpoises. That's a Julian Bond kind of joke. He had lots of those. So I was always waiting for the next joke from my buddy Julian. Well, Julian's public legacy has always been secondary to me. Him as a friend has always meant so much to me. I was telling Phyllis earlier that they all show up in my dreams regularly, and that has been the case for many years. They're always kids, but the original family was intact, and I just dream about them a lot because I just admired Julian so much and just enjoyed being with him so much that he was in fact one of my favorite people in all the world.